what's shaking, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Orangebloods Texas Football Channel. I'm Jeff Ketchum. That's Jason Sukumel. And we're taking your suggestions to heart. Someone mentioned, many of you have mentioned over the course of the last 12 months that you wanted us to do back in the day recruiting stories. So that's what we're doing. We're talking Vince Young's recruitment from 20 years ago. Oh, my God. Jason, that in itself is such a kick in the balls.
I sit here with my gray beard and my gray hair growing in. Yeah, exactly, man.
I had hair back then. Look, this video, I did. Jason Sukumel once knew me when I wouldn't say I had a head full of hair, but it hadn't completely started to completely fall out yet. This video brought to you by myperfectfranchise.net. Are you tired of working for the man? Are you tired of not dictating your own schedule and determining your future in life? That's kind of what Andy over at myperfectfranchise.net does. He helps people get started in terms of making their dreams come true, starting your own franchise in the business that you choose. He can help you along the way. Reach out to Andy from myperfectfranchise.net. But the bottom line is, it's time to start living the dream. Like Sukumel and I, living the dream, working at Orangebloods. So, Jason, we're talking about Vince Young's recruitment today. And it was 20-something years ago. And when I thought of when people were talking about conceptually this back in the day kind of revisiting of famous recruitments, Vince Young's popped up because I think there's a story there that most Texas fans don't know. And I think there's a lot that we'll be able to talk about in this video that will educate some people on like how that whole thing unfolded. So what are your basic memories? What do you remember most from that recruitment as we dig deep into a 20-year memory well?
Man, you know, I just keep hearing 20 years, 20 years. I'm like, that's just crazy to me that it's A, it's been 20 years, and B, I totally forgot this catch. Like my wedding anniversary was on Wednesday of this week, 20-year wedding anniversary. That was also my 20-year anniversary when I started with Orangebloods. I think I missed that. Maybe I was so focused on my wedding anniversary. I mean, I think it might, because I remember my anniversary with Orangebloods coincided with my wedding when I got married. You were in my wedding, and then I think I went on honeymoon, and I started with Orangebloods right when I got back from the honeymoon.
I almost ruined your wedding.
Yeah, you and probably me, and probably no worse than I probably could have done. But what I remember about Vince's recruitment, obviously, as I said, I was just getting started with Orangebloods. I was still covering recruiting a little bit before that for a magazine, a different publication. But I just remember Vince being. If you fast forward and put Vince Young today in today's recruiting world, where everything is under a microscope, it's going to be so different, right? I mean, we're going to follow his every move. You know, you certainly don't want to say the number one player in the country flew under the radar. That's not the case at all. But he didn't have the exposure that we're used to seeing now. But, what I remember about Vince Young is, frankly, still looking back 20 years, still probably the best high school athlete I've ever seen. I always say him and Adrian Peterson, I think, were the two best I've ever seen. I remember seeing Vince at the Army All-American Bowl down in San Antonio, or back then it was Army All-American Bowl, down in San Antonio. This is back, I think it might have been the first year of that game. It was played outside. I remember going down there and covering his recruitment, or covering his performance down there. He won MVP. Even down there, man, he was head and shoulders above everybody else. But what I also remember about Vince Young's recruitment, and this is a little thing, this is just me pulling from my memory bank. I remember calling Vince to do an interview, and I remember asking for Vincent Young. I would call him on his landline. Dude, this is before cell phones. And I'm calling Vincent Young and interviewing Vincent Young on his cell phone, and we're talking the dynamics of his recruitment. There was a time when Texas didn't think they were going to get him, or people didn't think Texas was going to get him. We'll get into all that. Tim Brewster standing on the table for that recruitment and doing a good job of getting Texas involved there and kind of winning Vince over. But certainly probably the most dynamic player in the history of us covering recruiting, changed the face of the Texas football program. So, arguably the biggest recruiting story we've ever covered. didn't quite get the kind of coverage that it probably or certainly would get in today's day and age.
Yeah, it's funny. His recruitment was somewhat framed around Reggie McNeal,
Yeah.
Lufkin, and ended up signing with Texas A&M, and really was a good college player. I will forever remember A&M beating Oklahoma when the Sooners were number one in the country, and Reggie McNeal had that big game. And for so long, it felt like their careers were intertwined. Who was going to be the best guy from that class? And then in the end, Vince Young becomes a college football Hall of Famer, one of the best players that ever lived. And Reggie McNeal's kind of a footnote in the history of A&M football when it's all said and done. I remember watching those guys at the Nike camp in that conversation. I think the Nike camp when Vince was either, I remember going to the Nike camps a little bit further back than Vince. So like, I remember seeing Vince Young at the 1999 Nike camp, which was in College Station. And that was where Chance Mock made his name and kind of exploded on the national scene that day. I will forever remember Vince Young and scouting him in person his senior year. And I'm looking at the story that I wrote, which was published on December 10th, 2001. You can go all the way back into the archives and find it. And I had kind of forgotten about this. I remember the huge performance. What I had forgotten was he was so big his senior year that the fans from other teams were showing up to watch him play. It really is kind of pre-social media, everything that every high school athlete does being promoted and kind of shaped in a way that, is going to get the most eyeballs. It was a very organic thing. He played, I think, I'm looking at the article. Who in the hell was it? Hightower. They played Fort Bend Hightower. And I think one of the first years that Hightower had really started to make a name for themselves in high school football. And what I remember about that game was that Vince Young was so incredible that the fans on the Hightower side of the field were cheering for him. Like they went ape, over the idea that he was just out there doing his thing. He was so spectacular that, and I've never seen this before, 30,000 people in the Astrodome. And the entire stadium, including the other team's fan base, cheering and like applauding and reacting to how spectacular he was. I wrote that night. I'm looking back at it. It says, by the midway point of the third quarter, Young again took off for a long touchdown run again down the Madison sideline. This time, several Hightower defenders had the angle on him, but they didn't just have the juice as Young smoked every defender chasing him for another score. That's when I left. The score was 44-14 at the time. Young finished the game with 403 yards of offense and 5 touchdowns. He passed for 286 and 3 scores, rushed for 117 and 2 more. He would have even had more yards rushing, but a bad snap in the third quarter led to a big loss. Now, Drew Brees is the best quarterback I have ever seen play high school football. I say that because I was able to watch Brees play in person at least a dozen times, and I can list a roll of amazing attributes that ended up leading him to a great college career and a spot in the NFL.
Just a spot. He had a roster spot.
Just a spot. However, no quarterback has ever rocked my senses in a single game like Young. He has everything. As a passer, he showed great poise, a quick release, tremendous pocket presence, nice touch, and the ability to make all the throws. Basically, I just raved about this guy, and it's amazing that it panned out. It's amazing that when it was all said and done, this guy that was being discussed in such, with such magnitude in the moment of like best guy I've ever seen turns out to be that guy in college. And I don't know that his success story can't be understated. Kid from Houston, doesn't come from anything. He comes to Texas with all of these expectations, and then to exceed them when it was all said and done really does, even 20 years later, make him the unicorn in the history of Texas football.
which is incredible to say the number one player in the country, number one recruit in the country, right?
Yeah.
Expectations, but he did. He exceeded expectations of the number one recruit in the country, maybe in a way that I can't remember anybody else doing. Was Reggie Bush number one? I think he might have been. I
He
mean,
was. And you might, Reggie probably exceeded.
yeah, but I mean, Vince and Reggie Bush in 20 years are, right there. And of course, they
Adrian Peterson. It's crazy how those guys were all bunched together.
I almost view Adrian Peterson as a better NFL. I mean, he's a very incredible college player too, of course. But
I second in the Heisman as a freshman.
Yeah, well, I know, but I picture Adrian Peterson more as a NFL player. I picture Vince Young,
yeah,
to some degree, Reggie Bush, as their heights of their success were more in college. Vince, again, man, when you saw Vince in high school, 20 years, he was the best I've ever seen. I mean, it was a man among boys, and he carried that over to college. And, even when he came to Texas, it was one of those deals where everybody's just waiting for Vince to hit the field. And, Chance Mock, you mentioned Chance was ahead of him. But there was also, that just always kind of bubbled under the surface. And once Vince took the field, I mean, there was no turning back. I remember, Ketch, you and I this is back in the day when practices, I think spring practice, maybe even fall camp were open, right? Every practice, every minute of every practice. And you and I would go watch Vince Young at practice at Texas. And we're like, man, this guy, a little 10-yard swing pass, he's throwing it in the dirt. He can't hit anybody. He can't do anything.
So bad.
Yeah, and we're like, is this ever going to translate to the college game? But when the lights came on, and you saw it in the two Rose Bowls, you saw the national championship game, when the lights came on, there was just even in high school, something with Vince Young. The bigger the stage, the better he played. And he's the best I've ever seen. And, we'll see. I mean, I don't want to say I'll never see anybody better, but it's going to have to be really, really impressive for anybody to take that mantle away from Vince Young as being the best high school player I've ever seen. And it's funny, you mentioned he and Reggie McNeal. I had to pull it up as you were talking. Reggie was ranked number 5 nationally, and it's where he finished in the Rivals 100. And that was such a debate in such a point of conflict almost between Texas and Texas A&M fans. Who was the better prospect? Who was going to be the better player? It ended up being such a non-story.
And that never really happened again.
No, it never did. Once they got to college, it didn't. You said, hey, Reggie did some fine things in college, but Vince took it to a whole other level that Reggie just couldn't even keep up with it. It wasn't even a discussion, and it never was, and it still isn't.
I think there's a post in the classics from 2004 where one of the A&M websiter guys claimed that Reggie was going to have like a better 2004, 2005 than Vince Young, and it's crazy. So this is one of the things I wanted to talk about though, Jason, was the timeline of Vince Young's recruitment is the thing that I don't think people understand. So I'm going to blow your mind, okay? The first quote I'm going to give you comes from August 3rd, 2001. So a month before his senior season begins and roughly 5 months before he signs with Texas. This is from Vince Young's mom. Quote, "We've ruled Texas out as Vincent has decided that he probably won't stay in the state of Texas to play in college. We've also ruled out Florida State and Miami as he's looking towards the smaller colleges, not one of the big names." So when we talk about Vince Young at Texas, the thing that I most remember, I think about his recruitment, is how far Texas was out of it. Imagine Arch Manning announcing something on August 3rd of 2001, like 5 months before Arch Manning makes his decision. And the school that he eventually signs with isn't in his top 5 or top 6 and has been publicly declared out by the parent in charge. It's crazy, but Tim Brewster did such a good job that they came from behind, and Texas ended up winning this thing like really soundly. There wasn't a true number 2, but 3 weeks later, and one of the cool things I've done is I took screenshots of a lot of this, Jason. So while we're talking, the people in the videos will be able to see these quotes. On August 21st, so 3 weeks later, he does another interview with Rivals, and he lists a top six. Vince Young's top six at the end of August: Miami, LSU, Florida State, Kansas State, Oklahoma, and Southern Miss.
Wow. Yeah, I'm looking
He
at
had a big Southern Miss was a school that hung in his top five all the way until the very end. And there was a lot of thought that had this, there was a Steve McNair factor there, that he might go play at a smaller Mississippi school because he was getting counsel and advice and something to think about there. His recruitment started to change. Well, another quote from that exact same time from Young, it's guys like Florida State, Kansas State, Oklahoma, LSU, Miami, Tennessee, and Southern Miss. That's basically my final group. He listed 7 schools, and Texas wasn't in the 7 schools at the end of August going into his senior season. And then Tim Brewster got involved.
Wasn't too long after, because I'm looking, it was August when Texas really kind of started to surge there. Yeah.
By the middle of September, in an article on rivals.com, he says, quote, "I'm down to Texas, Oklahoma, Miami, Florida State, Kansas State, and Southern Miss." So, and it was at that point that he told the coaches, these are my final 6 schools. So Tennessee, LSU, they got pushed out, and Texas makes the cut. And then no less than 6 to 8 weeks later, that recruitment's over. Tim Brewster is, for 20 years, people have been talking about Tim Brewster coming back to Texas. Every time there's a coaching change, someone has got Tim Brewster, and he's coached everywhere.
He does move around, yeah.
He is a gypsy. He's a nomad. He's a guy that just constantly moves around. And Texas fans have dreamed about him returning back to Austin for 20 years. It's all because of this. It's all because in Vince Young's recruitment, Texas went from 0 to hero in a span of 6 to 8 weeks, and it was almost all Tim Brewster. And what was really fascinating, I don't know if you remember this, Texas had a commitment from Billy Don Malone as its quarterback at the time. And they were kind of content to go with Billy Don Malone until Tim Brewster made the Vince Young thing happen. And then Billy Don Malone just kind of disappeared.
I'm looking, Ketch, I mean, you're taking me down memory lane a little bit. I mean, I think I did a Q&A with Vince.
You did.
And I think that was my first story with Orangebloods. It was
certainly one of them.
Yeah, it was after he signed. Like I said, I think I started in March. But I'm looking back, he committed on January 13th. So he went very late, which wasn't abnormal back then.
Yeah.
Right? Until January, even February. I can read you this, if you'll indulge me, this entire commitment story written by our old friend Jeremy Crabtree. Houston Madison quarterback Vince Young has apparently decided to end the recruiting process just as it was beginning to heat up. According to his mother, Felicia, Young committed to Texas on his visit this weekend. Quote, "He's in the shower right now," his mother said. Quote, "He committed, but you'll have to talk to him about it. He's in the shower right now. Call him back in 30 minutes. End quote. For the nation's top player, Rivals 100 definitely will. That's Vince Young's commitment story. How much has the world changed, right? Since when Vince was a commit. But yeah, I mean, I don't even know what day of that week that would have been, but it said he committed this weekend. So it may have been several days after he committed when it came out per his mother as Vince was in the shower. That just blows my mind, man. The number one player in the country. That's how it broke.
I also wrote a commitment story that day that didn't involve him being in the shower. And what Vince said was, quote, "Coach Brown came into a meeting with the quarterbacks on Saturday and told me right away that he didn't want me as a wide receiver or a defensive back. He wanted me as a quarterback. That's exactly what I wanted to hear, end quote. And that was crazy to think that would even need to be done.
Well, that was the talk of maybe why Texas was down his list early on, is they weren't recruiting him as a quarterback, right? And I mean, they had to convince him, no, we want you as a quarterback, which is, again, you're right. It blows your mind to look back and think of it that way. But yeah.
He got a standing ovation at the Irwin Center. Do you remember that day that he showed up on his official visit? They run him out to the basketball game, and the crowd goes nuts. They start chanting his name. He gets a standing ovation. And that was another one of the things that helped put it over the top. He said, quote, there's a lot of love down there at Texas, and that's what I'm looking for before I visited. They made my mom smile, and that's all I needed to see. I committed to them this afternoon. You know, when Texas fans try to do these things where they impact, right? Like, go to the basketball games and be seen and be heard. And if they take them by the baseball game, like, let them know that we know they're there. They're trying to recreate this thing that happened with Vince Young. It was really like a storybook recruitment, what was all said and done. The way they landed him, how it all came together, the Irwin Center trip. You know, you mentioned the All-American game down in San Antonio. A lot of Texas guys were at that game, whether it was like Larry Dibbles or Aaron Harris and Justin Blaylock and all those guys working on him to go to Texas. And it's I'll just wrap it up again and just simply saying it's crazy to me, that it's been 20 years. In a way, it feels longer than that. It feels like a lifetime ago. You mentioned it. You had just gotten married. Both of us had just, you know, I started Orangebloods in 2001. You were the first thing we did was hire you. And as soon as we had enough money to hire a person, like, you came aboard. And I can't believe you, in 2002, you could sneak in questions into we could write about them taking showers, apparently. And in your Q&A with him on one of the first articles that you would have written on Orangebloods, you asked him if you could go on a date with any celebrity, who would it be? Just for the record, his answer was Olympic gymnast Dominique Dawes back in the day.
Hard-hitting journalism right there, right?
That's why we went after you. Only the most hard-hitting journalism possible. If you could go on a date with any celebrity. I wonder if he ever got that date.
You know, who knows? As his reputation grew, maybe he did. He probably could have.
Last story. I remember Albert Hardy, the running back, telling me.
He talks about Albert Hardy in that Q&A too. Yeah.
They went to a club in Houston. Don't mean to. Enough time has gone by. I don't think I can get Vince in trouble for talking about where he apparently went to a club at the age of 18. Now, Hardy told me the story about how because he was with Vince, they skipped the lines of the club. They got put into VIP, and he was like, everybody wanted to meet Vince. And he said that they're sitting in VIP as high school kids, and Stevie Franchise comes in from the Rockets, Steve Francis, and that Francis goes into, who at that point was like a worldwide brand as a basketball player, made a point to enter the VIP section of this club that they were in so that he could introduce himself to Vince, who again was just a high school player and hadn't. And again, we've never seen anything quite like it. We probably never will. The more and more I think about his recruitment and think about some of the elements in it, it was just a different world back then than exists in 2022.
You know, Arch Manning might be the closest thing we'll ever get, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still completely different than Vince and, you know, the way things were and the way it was covered. But in terms of a guy that can walk into any room, any club, any place, any restaurant, and
have guys wanting to meet him.
Absolutely. And people are going to stop and take notice, and they're going to come up to them and want to have a picture taken or whatever it is nowadays they do. yeah, Arch might be the closest thing we'll ever have to Vince Young, but that's how big Vince was back then. Wasn't covered as publicly as it is nowadays, of course, but yeah, I mean, probably, I'll say it again, probably not. He was the best high school player I've ever seen. Probably the biggest recruit I've ever seen. You know, maybe Arch may be in that same realm as well.
We'll be doing more of these videos. We'll do a Daryl Scott video where Jason can just tell the story of being blackballed from a kid's announcement after going and making, I don't know how many miles that trip was, but it was like 1,000
trips. I did it twice. I went out to Cali twice. Yeah.
We'll do that. We'll do Adrian Peterson. Like we'll hit on all of the big recruitments, over the course of the rest of this offseason. This is the first back in the day recruiting discussion between myself and Jason Sukumel. There will be more to come. I might have to see if I can get Andy Lascano from our old boss from KI. I haven't talked to him in a long time, but I wonder if I can get him on to do a video talking about the recruitment of Eli Manning. Because way back in the day, it was Andy and myself who really were covering that recruitment. And it was Andy and I who almost got KI banned from covering Texas athletics because we dared interview him on the field with Archie. Too many Mannings at this point in my head. But look, for myperfectfranchise.net, again, the sponsor of this video, reach out to Andy from myperfectfranchise.net and let him help you begin your quest of living the dream and owning your own business and being your own boss and dictating your own future. But for myself and Jason Sukumel, we'll talk to you soon. Later.